A one-shot manga is a form of manga in which the entire story is presented in a single volume without continuation. Prior to recently, I didn't even know that one-shot manga existed, as it hadn't occurred to me that a mangaka could fit everything that they wanted to portray into what might amount to the length of a normal volume in a normal manga. However, after reading Look Back and Goodbye Eddie by Tatsuki Fujimoto, it was made apparent that a one-shot manga can create just as much emotion as a full-length manga can create. I had already read two other pieces of work by Fujimoto, those being Chainsaw Man and Fire Punch, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I even made an entire video about Fire Punch, so if you're interested in that manga, then go check it out. Being so infatuated with these two manga made me even more interested in these two one-shots by Fujimoto, as I know what he is capable of in terms of storytelling and character design, so I dived into both of them as soon as I could get my hands on them. I will go over each of them individually and give my analysis on why I think both of them are exceptional and how each of them are able to tell such vivid and meaningful stories in such a short amount of pages. I hope you enjoy. The first of Fujimoto's one-shots that I read is called Look Back. I went into it with no prior knowledge of the story at all, so I was actually quite surprised to see how incredibly normal it appeared. Obviously, if you have read either of Fujimoto's full series, you will be aware that he is no stranger to otherworldly and gruesome concepts, with shock factors being one of the driving forces for many parts of his manga. Look Back is the exact opposite. It's an easy to digest story about two children who both have an interest in drawing manga. It felt like to me that Fujimoto was either taking a break from the extremely intense worlds he has created in the past, or potentially testing himself in a way to see if he could create the same amount of suspense in a world that comparatively is purely dominated by normality. Even with this normality, however, I was intrigued from beginning to end. Two child prodigies that excel at different parts of drawing manga, that team up as a story creator and illustrator duo, pumping out one-shots and being serialized prior to both of them even turning 18. You get to see the dynamic between them, the way they help each other grow. At the start of it, the main character, Fujino, practically hated who she considered her competition, Kiyomoto, as Kiyomoto's art was miles ahead of her in terms of detail and quality. This, however, sets up an unlikely bond where they help each other in the areas that they lack, as Kiyomoto expressed to Fujino how much she loved her manga because Fujino was able to inject emotion and storytelling, as opposed to Kiyomoto's manga strips that were just exceptional looking background art. I mentioned how Fujino practically hated Kiyomoto for excelling in places that she wasn't good at, and for the first portion of the book, I actually didn't really like Fujino's character much at all. Primarily because she was cocky and childish to the people around her. I held this position until I sat and realized that many times in anime and manga, many of the child characters are portrayed as mature, and you can't help but think, how are they able to think and form concepts on the same level as an adult? Now this is where Fujimoto does something so incredibly simple, but amazing at the same time. He writes Fujino to act childish because, and I'll get this is a crazy concept, she is a child. And before you say anything, obviously he's not the first to do this, but throughout all of Fujimoto's works, I constantly have to praise how well he is at writing his characters to feel relatable and realistic, and this is just another case. The constant praise she received about her manga strips prior to Kiyomoto coming into the picture has blown up her ego, and it is clear in the ways she interacts with those around her. It's not an outlandish idea by any means to write a character to act how they would realistically, but it's something that Fujimoto does consistently well, so I can't help but articulate it. It's just another quality that makes this manga feel real whenever you're reading it. While it is a simple story with well-written characters and a few twists to elicit emotion in the reader, with a touch of sorrow building as the story goes on, which you can definitely see in Kiyomoto's face, there was one thing that I was trying to put my finger on whilst reading it. I was trying to find the true meaning behind this manga in a way. That's not to say that every form of media needs to have a true meaning, as a story can just be a story for the sake of being a story, but I felt like there was something here, especially when I went to reread it for the second time. The first thing I caught that's pretty simple is just that if you combine Fujino and Kiyomoto's names, you get Fujimoto, which isn't anything crazy, it's just a play on words. However, I feel like this goes deeper than that. To me, it seems that Fujimoto has split up either side of the creative process. Since for all of his series, the story and art for his works are done by him. Obviously, there's probably a team working around him, but he's the head of it. When you take a look at the characters and look back, Fujino could be akin to Fujimoto's side that focuses on characters and storyline, while Kiyomoto is the side that focuses on background art and paneling structure. Throughout all of Fujimoto's works, it is clear he's extremely talented when it comes to using his pen. Vibrant works of art with multiple layers and perspective work that helps portray exactly what he's trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that I think Fujino and Kiyomoto are either side of him. You can even see it in this manga, with the amount of detail in the background art. I had to stop and look at many of the pages to fully gather the details within them. However, apart from the art, the story is building to something that can nearly bring you to tears. That part for me was at the end, when Fujino takes a look back at how things could have been different. This is one of my favorite portrayals that authors do with their works, where they pose a flashback that didn't actually happen, but what could have happened, with another good example being the final episode of Horimiya. With the final nail in the coffin for this manga being Fujino posed with the question of why she even draws in the first place, since she stated that it can be a hassle. This final section of manga panels is really what gets the tears flowing. To me, this is a story of Tatsuki Fujimoto looking back on his journey up till now. Similar to how his 17 to 21 manga is a collection of short stories he made, Look Back could be a story about his story, if that makes sense. There's even inklings of references to his past works, such as Fujino literally creating a manga called Shark Kick, kind of like a jab to the name Fire Punch, in this panel that has background art straight out of Fire Punch. And I almost forgot to include this art project that Kiyomoto was working on in the alternate flashback. Look familiar? Even disregarding me looking much too deep into it, Look Back without all of this analysis is still an exceptional manga that created lots of emotion within me just within one volume's length, that potentially an entire anime and manga series couldn't match. The ending, while it may be cliche in some regards, still was extremely sad, and the retrospectivity of Fujino even layered more sadness on top of it. Once she went back home and sat back down at her desk, that whole section of panels gave me goosebumps. Like life must go on, even with those that won't be present in it anymore. Quite the contrast to Look Back though. We have what I believe is the most recent one shot by Fujimoto, correct me if I'm wrong, called Goodbye Eddie. Going into this, I had some preconceived notions that it may be similar to Look Back in terms of content, such as nothing supernatural, a bit more normal than the likes of Fire Punch and Chainsaw Man, and to some degree it is. However, there are definitely more inklings of the unhinged Fujimoto that many of us have come to know and love. It deals with a more normal world, just twisted through the eyes of our protagonists. Look Back was a fairly simple story, whereas Goodbye Eddie is much more intense, especially in terms of the topics that it covers. I would consider this manga to be more of a thriller, as opposed to Look Back being more of a drama. Upon rereading it for my analysis, I realized that my heart was racing throughout the entire thing, just as much as it was on the first read. There are so many twists, so many layers to the story, so much depth to the characters that are presented through inklings that build as the story goes on. Each character still feels real, and the portrayal of almost the entire manga through a smartphone lens helps add to that realism, while also sort of changing the medium of presentation in a way. The shakiness at certain parts, the camera angles, the added unnecessary shots that aren't actually unnecessary. This is like watching a movie, except it is even more enjoyable because it is a movie presented in the medium of a manga. The main protagonist is recording almost everything that takes place in his life because upon receiving a smartphone, his mother wished for it, as it was most likely her dying wish. She wanted Yuta, the MC, to be able to look back on her fondly after she dies, which is why, upon the request that Yuta literally film her dying moments, he can't help but refuse, as such a morbid request would make anyone refuse. One thing leads to another, and upon the presentation of this movie to his school, he is met with negative reviews from his classmates. And to be fair, he had no real direction for the movie, or any skills to even create a film that would be regarded as good. So these negative reviews drive him to suicide, but on the brink of ending it all, he meets Eddie, the pivotal character in this manga. She even says that his movie was shit, but she still enjoyed every bit of it as it was out of the norm and not something just anyone would think up. So essentially, she saw potential in him. Side note, the idea of being out of the norm is something that I also felt the same about upon first reading Fire Punch, which definitely has that same feeling. But anyway, Yuta now spends his time filming his life in preparation for another movie, along with studying up on his cinema knowledge. As I mentioned earlier, that the movie wasn't even really well made because he doesn't really watch that many movies. This is when you can start to see a contrast between Yuta's mother and Eddie. He starts spending all of his time filming her, filming things around her, spending time with her, similar to how he was with his mom prior to her death. Of course, you probably also know that later on he finds out that Eddie is dealing with a similar illness to his mother. It's pretty clear that the sorrow within Yuta's life is just building and building, especially when you realize that his mother wasn't even a good mother to him. He only included the parts in the movie that made her seem like a good mom, as he wanted to remember her as a good person. The ability to create things but keep the portrayals with them in line with what you want the audience to see is something amazing, and I think Fujimoto is trying to get this across to the audience. Later on in the manga, his father even shows gratitude for how Yuta portrayed his mom because he was able to look back on it fondly as well. However, there was a problem with this too. Yuta is having a shit life, and in his first film, he tried his hardest to scrub that out. But this might have been a fault with the movie in some ways. Yuta realizes that not filming his mother's death was a fault that he should have included because there was no resolution within him. He then settles on fixing the problems with the first movie in his second movie. Eddie can be considered a do-over in a sense, although it is much deeper than that. You still can't help but feel sorry for him though. So many undertones of misery are coming from everyone in his life that's close to him besides his father dying. With even later on in life, his entire family that he creates dies as well. This could be your sad, cliche main character, terrible backstory type thing, but it's not, because Yuta isn't a cliche main character. He goes about things differently in this manga. He's weird, and his brain doesn't work like the normal. He slips into a depression like almost anyone else would, but the way he goes about coping or dealing with his issues has always surprised me. Just like the way he went about ending his mother's movie. There's a lot of blurred lines within this manga that I can also appreciate. You never really know what is supposed to be part of the movie being filmed at each point, and what is an unscripted moment, if you get what I mean. I'm having a hard time explaining in full detail exactly how this manga made me feel, as it isn't as straightforward as Look Back in that sense. Look Back was supposed to be set out as sad almost from the very beginning. Whereas with Goodbye Eddie, it's a manga that you don't necessarily feel good after reading, but the resolution along with how the characters develop and the outcomes of many of the ideas present in this manga make it exciting from beginning to end. There's so many minuscule additions that propel this manga higher than most. Some I've already mentioned before, like camera shakes and different angles, and even a change in speech bubble type that may help portray a different tone when it is not directly being conveyed through the faces of the people present in the manga. The culmination of everything I've stated so far, with the addition of a touch of supernatural and the weird yet likable personality of Yuta, create an experience that is harsh and unforgiving, yet wholesome and satisfactory. It's a manga that plays more off of your feelings than it plays off the specific story present. And the feeling it creates is the light at the end of the tunnel. The thing I can't explain, but the thing I still feel so strongly. The story ties into itself in multiple different parts. It's gritty while still being beautiful. And it's like I mentioned earlier many times, the characters are what keep you dragged in and interested. It's not as cut and dry as Look Back's main story. And Look Back has depth, but in different ways to Goodbye Eddie. But I think both of these manga are extremely well written, and the amount of ideas and content that Fujimoto packs into one volume each is astounding. If you haven't read either one of these manga, then I highly recommend it, because with each piece of work he releases, it becomes more and more apparent that Fujimoto has something special going on with his creativity, and I'm looking forward to even more coming from him. Thanks for watching.